Hello there. Good morning to everyone. I just gotta find my page here. A few days ago, I had a dream, and most of this doesn't matter, but it was like I was at some kind of big reunion with a bunch of people, and most of them were like friends from a long time ago, like when I was in high school and college. And at one point in the dream, I was in the hallway. It was like a huge um, party, and we were in the hallway. I was talking to an old friend who was really, really good at baseball. And I asked him, or he asked me in the dream, he said, so are your kids uh, planning on playing in the Net 6 League, the Net 6 Baseball League? Now, you don't know what the Net 6 Baseball League is because I made that up in a dream years ago. So, and I had forgotten about it. If you had asked me last week, hey, have you ever heard of this thing called the Net 6 Baseball League? I would have said, what are you talking about? That sounds stupid. I've never heard about what that is. But in my dream recently, from in the past week, in my dream, my own mind remembered it. My subconscious remembered this former dream I had about the Net 6 Baseball League, even though in my conscious mind I would have never remembered that. But in my dream, I was reminded to my dreaming self about Net 6. And then I knew what it was, and I was like, oh yeah, Net 6, that's awesome. So it was just a really strange moment where my own mind, my subconscious dream mind, could remember something that the person standing here forgot about years ago. Um, so that was just one of the examples I think is so awesome about the human mind. Like it can do that, and somewhere in my mind, it remembers all this stuff, even though my normal person, conscious person out here, has forgotten most of the stuff I've ever thought about before. So the human mind is awesome. I love those things about the human mind. Um, the the human mind, our personality, our persons, our beings are capable of doing incredible stuff. Not just remembering subconscious dreams from long ago, but one of the other things I always find fascinating is how people make these observations about how married couples over time begin to resemble each other. And I know there's the research is divided on that. Why is that? Is it because people choose people subconsciously that kind of look like you anyways, or do we actually change our do our bodies and our faces and our personalities kind of change and morph into one another over time? So that's kind of cool. But in either way, that is the case. Sometimes it's the case that people who've been married for a long time end up having some of those same features about them, and that's cool too. We're going to talk about in the book of Exodus as we're traveling through the book of Exodus. We're on number 9 today, I think, in our series, and we're going to talk about a story about Moses, whose face begins to resemble that of God's. He begins to look like God in some aspect. So we're going to look at that story. That's in Exodus 34. And I did preach on this exact text last year, so I'm going to try to look at it from another angle again this time around. But just to summarize, we've come to Mount Sinai. Moses is up there on the mountain in Exodus 32, and he's been there, since earlier on in Exodus. And all of a sudden, God says, something's going on down there at the bottom of the mountain. The people have just gone, they're not even doing anything that's right anymore. They're making this golden calf. They're calling it Yahweh. They're worshiping it. They're in this weird festival state where they're doing a bunch of, engaging in illicit activities and all that stuff. And it's just this whole thing, this whole project is a huge failure. Go down tell him, I'm out. I'm out. So Moses is like, oh, come on, it's not that bad. But Moses goes down and sees it. He's like, this is really bad. And he gets really mad, and he throws down the 10 Commandments that he's been given from God, these stone tablets, and pulverizes them, crushes them on the ground. And Moses is like, what's going on here? Why do you guys make this golden calf? And Aaron's like, I don't know, it just like showed up. It like created itself. And Moses is like, whatever, melt the thing, ground it up, and put it in the water. Remember the water at the mountain that God gave to the people? He's like, put it in that water, and then I'm gonna make all of you guys drink it. And then God's like, okay, I'm done with this people. They don't care 1 second about me. They don't care about this covenant. Went through all this trouble. They don't care about anything, so I'm out. And Moses says, now God, hold on. We've both been pretty upset here, but I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think that you need to stay with your people. Think about the promises that you made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Think about what all the nations are going to say about you if the story ends here, this very short story, and then it's just God brought them out of Egypt, and then he abandoned them in the wilderness, and they all died. That's not a good story. That's not what you're about. That's not who you are. And eventually, Moses convinces God, changes his mind. And God says, okay, I'll go with the people. I'll remain with them. And he decides to stay and keep going into this covenant with the people. And Moses says, okay, would you mind proving that? Would you mind giving me a little guarantee that you're going to stay with us? Would you mind showing me your glory, God's honor, God's person, God's being? And God agrees to that. He agrees to do that. And that's the story that we read about in Exodus 34, where God says, I'm going to put you in this little spot in the mountain, and I'm going to pass by in front of you. And as I pass by, I'm going to cover you with my hand so that you can't like take in the fullness of my glory, because that doesn't go well for humans. But I'm going to let you like see me as I pass by, and you'll see the backside of me. And so that's what happens. So in Exodus 34 here in our text today, starting in verse 1, which we already read this morning, God says, cut for yourself 2 stone tablets like the former ones. I'll write on the tablets the words that were on the former ones. Get ready in the morning, come up to the mountain, present yourself to me there. Don't let anyone else come with you. In verse 4, Moses does that stuff. He gets up early. He takes some tablets with him. And then in verse 5, Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood there with him. And he called upon the name of Yahweh. Yahweh passed in front of him, and God himself says these words. The Lord God, that's the name Yahweh. Yahweh Elohim, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth or faithfulness, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, by no means leaves the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. And Moses bowed low to the ground and pleads with God one more time to take the people, pardon their sins, and that's what God ends up doing. So in a story about God having to use Israel's middle name, you know, about when you get in trouble as a kid and the middle name comes out, when your mom or your dad is upset and they say include your middle name in addressing you, that's trouble, right? You're in trouble. God is kind of doing that metaphorically because Israel's in trouble. But in this story about Israel's middle name, Israel being in trouble, God reveals his full name here. And we've already been at the burning bush with Moses where God reveals his name, Yahweh. We've talked about that in previous lessons. But here God seems to say, well, my full name is this. 32 words in the Hebrew text. Yahweh Elohim, this is verse 6, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth or faithfulness, who keeps loving kindness for thousands of generations, who forgives iniquity and transgression and sin, doesn't leave the guilty unpunished, visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. That's God's full name. And he's telling that to Moses. This is how he's revealing his glory to Moses, by revealing his full name. And we see who God is here. It's not just about showing, his what the things that Moses can see as God goes by him, but he is revealing his nature and character through this language, the speech, revealing his full name. And we read about a God who is primarily, and in his nature, a God of forgiveness, a God of compassion, a God of loving kindness, a God of grace, a God who is slow to anger. Is it true that God judges? Yes, he points that out. He's not a God who is unjust. He is a God who sees evil and oppression and injustice, and he will punish that. That's part of what he does. But as Terence Fretheim says, wrath is not a part of the nature of God. Wrath is something that God does as a response to certain historical events. But wrath isn't part of who God is. That's not what he is. His nature, his person, is grace and mercy and forgiveness and compassion. And if we take this text literally, and even if we just take it to say that God is keeping loving kindness for 1,000 generations, maybe not even plural thousands, but 1,000, and then punishes for 4, well, that's 1,000 to 4, or a 250 to 1 ratio, right? So at the very least, if you want to take this literally and do the math game, God is 250 times more gracious than he is about judgment. That's what God is trying to explain to Moses here in this context of this story about Israel's sin and God's judgment, and then God's ultimately his forgiveness and going along with the people. Now there's a story or a text in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 I want to read, because this is one where Paul is tracking with this story in Exodus. In 2 Corinthians 3, Paul, and this is really technical and kind of a difficult text to really understand. There's a lot of strange things that Paul is saying in here, so we're not going to go into detail on it. But he's tracking with this story about Moses and the people in the wilderness. And he says that that in verse 7, the ministry of death came in letters engraved on stones, and it came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses, because of the glory of his face was shining as it was. Now, this is a callback to Exodus 34 and a part of the text that we didn't read. But at the end of Exodus 34, the author talks about how Moses, when he came down from Mount Sinai, his face was, and there's a word that's hard to translate, but most people call it shining. And that's a word that only occurs here in Hebrew, this verb, karan, and nobody knows exactly what it means. A lot of people in the medieval period were thinking that it comes from the Hebrew noun keren, which means horn. It means horn. So if you look at any picture of Moses, work of art from the medieval period in history, they depict Moses with horns on his head, because they thought this is what that text means. And Greek and maybe even Latin translations at the time would translate this word Quran as Moses' head sprouted horns. But in modern translations, and most scholars today understand this word as shining or being radiant. And that's how Paul understood it too, by the way. So that's what Paul is talking about here, that Moses' face would come down, and whenever he would go into this special tent on the outskirts of the camp, He would meet with God in this place, in this tent. And the text says he would meet with God face to face, as with a friend. And when that would happen, Moses' face will translate as shine, become radiant again. So close and so intimate was Moses with God that it changed the way that he looked, changed his person, and changed his appearance. He began to look like God. He began to reflect the glory and the radiance of God that became a part of him as they looked at one another face to face in this tent of meeting. And when Moses would emerge from the tent, the people couldn't stand it. It's too much to look at. And so he would wear this veil over his face. That's what the text in Exodus talks about. And Paul is calling back to that story here. Moses has his face glorious, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face, even though it was fading away, and so on and so forth. So Paul continues to make these parallels, and he uses the word glory like 10 times in this text. If you scan down the page, you can see how many times Paul uses this word glory. He's talking about this old covenant had a lot of glory, but there's something even more glorious than what was happening to Moses and what was happening with God and those people back there in Exodus. And the thing that has even more glory than that is the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. And did you know, Paul says, that the same thing that happened to Moses with God on Mount Sinai and on the tent of meeting, that can happen to us today in some form. That's what he says in verse 17. He says, now the Lord, this is 2 Corinthians 3, verse 17. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, a new Exodus for us. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into that same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. He says that we have our faces unveiled, and we, like Moses, are being transformed into the image, that same image of the Lord from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. We're beholding the glory of the Lord as Moses was. We're being transformed as Moses was. That doesn't mean that our facial features are changing. We might not have like this literal radiance, but something is happening to us when we spend time looking at Jesus face to face, in communion with him. When we spend time looking at his image bearers in the church and looking at them face to face in communion with one another, something happens to us and it changes us. There's a transformation that takes place, and we begin to reflect the glory of the Lord. In 1850, an author named Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a short story called The Great Stone Face. And The Great Stone Face is a story about a little rural town. It doesn't say exactly where it is, but somewhere in the northeast United States. Little rural town. And one of the main features of this town is this great mountain. And in the side of the mountain, at the top, there is a special rock formation that when you look at it in a certain way, looks like the face of an old man. And there was a prophecy in this town, a local prophecy that said one day someone who would be native born in this town would eventually come to look like, resemble the man of the mountain, the face in the mountain. And that person would be the most generous, most wise person that has ever lived. And of course, that's something that everyone wanted to be. And everyone kind of hoped, well, maybe I could be the one who resembles the great stone face in the mountain. Well, there was a little boy in the town named Ernest. Ernest loved this prophecy. And Ernest knew that it was his mission to find out who the one would be that would resemble the great stone face. Who was the prophecy about? And he dedicated his life to this. And he would go around looking throughout the town, and he never really found anyone that did. And as time goes by and Ernest grows up to be a man, he's still living in town. And that legend kind of moved and permeated out into the rest of the United States, that prophecy. And people who started hearing it, even those who had moved away years ago. And there were different people who heard about this and said, well, I think that's me. I think I want to go back to my hometown and be recognized by the people as the one who is the one who resembles the great stone face. And so some people, eventually over the years, one person would return. And maybe it's this rich merchant would come, say, hey, here I am, I'm the one that looks like the great stone face. And all the people welcome him and celebrate him. But over a few days, and especially Ernest notices, I don't think you're it. I don't think you resemble the great stone face. There's some character flaws here, and some facial features that are off. And then a conquering war general comes to town. Look at me, I'm the great stone face. But again, no. Over time, we recognize, no, it's not you. And a politician returns to his hometown. It's me. And then eventually, this doesn't pan out. And Ernest is an old man. He's very wise now. He loves to help out and take care of people in the town. He's become a very great man. And he falls in love with this volume of poetry written by a man that he finds out used to live in the town. He's from the town. He was born there. And he does everything he can to try to connect up with this poet, this writer. And he finally meets him. And Ernest is sure that this is the guy who is the one who is the great stone face. And he's so excited, and Ernest has just fallen in love with his words, and they're so beautiful, and he knows. And finally the guy comes into town on the train, and Ernest meets him, and they come into town, and Ernest wants to celebrate that this writer, this poet, is the one that resembles the great stone face. But the writer, the poet, has to tell Ernest, I'm sorry, it's not me. It's not me. I wish it were. But those words of mine, those are just words. I don't reflect that in my own life. That's not what I am. There's a lot of inconsistencies between what I write and who I am. It's not me. I'm sorry. And Ernest is really disappointed. And over time, Ernest had become beloved by the people, and he kind of was naturally fell into this position of preaching these sermons to the people, especially at night, at these sunset sermons at the base of the mountain where the man's face is. And on the last day in town, the writer, the poet, decides he wants to listen to Ernest preach this sermon as a wise old man. And there he is before the people, and Ernest makes this very serious but compassionate face as he's preaching his sermon. And the poet, the writer, just stands up and exclaims, "Look, it's Ernest. Ernest is the face of the mountain. It's him." And Ernest looks at him, kind of confused, and he takes him by the arm, and they walk home. And he's like, "I'm sorry, it's not me." Ernest was too humble to realize that he had become the face in the mountain. And it's not that, and that happened because of how much time he had spent over the years meditating on that face, meditating on that character of that person in the mountain, whatever that would be. So much time face to face with that face on the mountain that Ernest eventually became that over time in his life. That's the sort of thing that Paul is talking about in this text. That when we spend time face to face with the Lord, with one another, we begin to be transformed into the image of God. I have a couple of PowerPoint slides here. You can see the inspiration for Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, The Great Stone Face. is actually this rock formation in New Hampshire. In fact, you remember the quarters, the different quarters for each state that were made? If you look at a New Hampshire one, there's a picture of this on the back of it. That's how cool this is in New Hampshire, okay? So this is the rock formation. That's the old postcard or something of it. But that's a picture of the actual mountain that inspired this story for Nathaniel Hawthorne. So the next slide, here's just a close-up of it, and you can see what he was talking about. It resembles this man, this great stone face. Now you can't tell how large those stones are until the next slide here. Oh, sorry. This is just an old picture. It's hard to see, but I imagined that Ernest was preaching this sermon here at the base of the hill, and this is when the moment of discovery happens with the writer-poet. Anyways, the next slide, you can see how big those stones are compared to the people that are climbing on them here. And this side-by-side picture looks kind of weird. You can't tell what's happening here. But sadly, ironically, in 2003, that rock formation slid off the face of the mountain, and it doesn't exist anymore. And that's what it looks like today. You can look at the next slide now. That's the final slide. So here is the great stone face, or what they call the old man in the mountain, the old man in the mountain in New Hampshire. But here's what it looks like today, because in 2003, all of those rocks slid off of the face of the mountain. So it's a very sad story. But I think we can use that as a metaphor, can't we, for what we're talking about today. Talking about beholding the glory of the Lord, of Jesus, by communing with him, by communing with one another. The mountain is a metaphor, and it's a question for us. Which one of these pictures resembles, depicts, describes my life, my situation? What is going on? Is the face of God present in my life? Do I reflect it, and am I able to reflect upon it? Is the face of God available to me? Do I access it? Is it there for me, and do I spend time meditating on God's face, spending time with him, spending time with his people? Or is the face of God missing in my life? Have I neglected it? Is it de facto not even there anymore? Is it something that used to be there in my life, but not really anymore? Might as well not be there at all. I think that's an important question that Paul poses for us, that this narrative in Exodus presents to us. Israel's person, their being, was transformed when they spent time with this false god, this false idol. Whatever God you spend time with, that transforms you. You come to resemble those things. You're transformed into the image of the God or the idol that you spend time with. And when they spent time in the wilderness with this golden calf that they made, they began to reflect that. They began to resemble that. And when Moses spends time with God, he begins to reflect and resemble that. And when the Israelites would repent and turn from their ways and spend time before God, they would begin to reflect and represent him as well. All of us have a God in our life, at least one. And whatever that idol is, that God is, that thing that we go to for security, for salvation, for comfort, for whatever it is that we use it for, we become to represent that and resemble that. Paul says that we need to be focused on the face of Jesus. And when we do that, we are transformed into the image of God. Now, I am, at times, and I've talked about before, I can be judgmental. I can walk through this world with a negative attitude and be like, oh, this person and that person, and look at this, look at that. And I could also make, every once in a while, I can be correct about a judgment. And God can do that stuff too. But when I see the description of God in Exodus 34, and I see that God, if you take it literally, is 250 times more gracious, compassionate, forgiving, loving than he is judgmental, I ask myself, well, am I being transformed into that image? For every time that I judge someone, do I have a 250 other times where I've extended grace to someone, where I've been merciful, where I have compassion for them like Jesus, where I go out of my way to help them, where I make an effort to see the good in them, to see the image of God in a person? Or is that closer to like a 1-to-1 ratio? Or is it more judgmental than it is gracious and merciful? That's even worse. The more time we spend in the presence of God, the more we're transformed into his image, his nature, and character. That's what Paul's calling us to do. So may we commit ourselves, or maybe even recommit ourselves to the face of Christ. The face of Christ in our communion with him, the face of Christ in our communion with others. May we continually be transformed into that image. Let's stand and sing.